In this demonstration, we'll add a measure using a source rule. To an existing factory file, we'll add a measure that references a source rule in the ED-log dataset. The ED-log contains information on patient traffic through the emergency department, including arrival and departure dates. Our measure will show the sum of all accounts with at least one visit on the ED-log. For the purposes of this demonstration, the following elements have already been defined. The dataset. We're using the ED-log dataset. The scope. We're using the scope ED-log, which establishes ED arrival date as our date column. The category. We're using the category Outpatient Volumes. We'll begin by opening our file, cfg.factory, in the Measure Factory editor. The Measures page opens. Next, we'll click New. The new measure is created and opens in the Detail pane with the default name New Measure 1. We'll name the measure ED Visits. Now we'll select a category for the measure. We'll select Outpatient Volumes. Next, we'll specify a scope for the measure. The scope name ED-log appears next to Scope in the Detail pane. Now we'll specify the calculation we want the measure to perform. We want the measure to tell us how many accounts had at least one visit on the ED-log, so we'll enter the expression DIMCount account ID in the calc field. This calculation counts the unique account IDs in the ED-log dataset. The expression DIMCount account ID appears in the calc field. We're not going to use the filter field because this measure doesn't require a filter, so we'll move on to the Format field. In the Format field, we'll choose the number format we want Measure Factory to use when it displays the results of the calculation. Next, in the Documentation section, we'll add a definition for our measure. And finally, we'll enter a brief description for our measure. We're now ready to save and then run the factory file. The resulting files are placed in the project's Factory Output folder. Let's look at factory.dbk to see our measure. In the Datasets area, we'll open ED-log. Now we'll dive on ED arrival date. Next, we'll add our measure column, Measure ED Visits, to the dive window, and remove the count column at the same time so we can see the results of the measure more clearly. The measure column shows the number of ED visits made on each ED arrival date in the dataset. To see the number of ED visits on the most current date in the dataset, we'll sort down on ED arrival date. So that's how you create a measure that uses a source rule. On the Measures page, you click New, name the measure, specify a category for the measure, specify a scope for the measure, specify the calculation you want the measure to perform, specify a format for the results of the calculation, and enter a definition for and description of the measure.